Welcome to the Fire These Times, a podcast dedicated to the easy task of tackling the 21st century from the periphery. This podcast is ad-free and accessible to everyone thanks to the generous donations of Patreon supporters on patreon.com/firethesetimes. For as little as $5 a month or $50 a year, you can help keep this podcast independent that way. The Fire These Times is named after the James Baldwin book The Fire Next Time, and the music is by Ibrahim Youssef. Thank you for listening and take care. Hey everyone. So this is a conversation with Martin Paul-Yves. The reason why I had him on is that I read an article of his called Just the First 2 Years about what the past 2 years of pandemic have been for him as someone with an autoimmune condition that I'm not even gonna try and pronounce. He'll pronounce it later. And I found it as I myself recently caught COVID following the Swiss government's decision to first reduce health measures before removing them altogether. As many governments remove all remaining health measures, life is becoming increasingly difficult for many people, especially those who are disabled or immunocompromised. What does this say about our political culture if we allow this to become the norm? This is what this conversation was about. We focused on the UK and Switzerland because this is where we are, but honestly, this is applicable to many other countries as well. This is a very important conversation, and unfortunately, I think it's going to be more relevant in the coming weeks and months. And as always, I thank you for listening and take care.
My name is Martin Paul-Yves. I'm Professor of Literature, Technology and Publishing at the University of London's Birkbeck College. I work primarily on contemporary American and British fiction, but also I do quite a bit of work studying scholarly communications. So looking at the way that academics communicate with one another, thinking about those cultures, how they're socialized, and understanding their place in contemporary science, really, I guess. I'm on the podcast today because I'm also extremely clinically vulnerable, and throughout the COVID pandemic, my health conditions have played a major role in my ongoing functionality and well-being. And I'm grateful today just to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about what that means and what the future looks like for people with similar circumstances.
I found your essay, your article, what have you, because I recently got COVID, which I will also talk about. Probably have recovered by now. It's been over 2 weeks, but I'll mention why this sort of isn't the end of the story, because there's one thing that links us here, which is you're in the UK and I'm in Switzerland, and both countries have been, let's say, well, let's just completely abandoning any kind of health restrictions. Here in Switzerland, we're recording this on April 4th. And as of, which is a Monday, and as of Friday, so April 1st, they removed all, everything, basically. And there's been a number of stuff that passed on like social media, on Swiss social media, or for example, the government, because they would send you a text when you had to quarantine, for example, after testing positive. And so my wife got it. She also got COVID, unfortunately, last week. And so she was supposed to quarantine until today, actually. Today would have been the last day. And on Friday, she got a text saying that basically you no longer need to quarantine. And so she got two different texts, essentially. The first, the medical one, and then the policy one that followed soon after. And there were a number of people who got it the same day as the new policy was implemented. And so they got two separate messages that were, contradictory, essentially. The first one saying you have to quarantine, and then immediately after, well, actually, you don't need to quarantine anymore. For you, as you already hinted at, it's a different sort of calculation altogether. So I suppose to start, or properly start this conversation, can you tell us how these past 2 years have been for you?
Sure. So, I mean, it's probably just worth backing up a bit. So, the reason that I'm vulnerable is that I have a set of autoimmune conditions, rheumatoid arthritis and vasculitis, that are treated essentially using chemotherapy medications. So, in particular, I was given a medication called rituximab around 2014 or so, which caused me permanently to have a condition called panhypogammaglobulinemia, which basically means I can't produce the antibody components in relation to either an infection or the vaccination. And really, my immunology department was very clear early on, you mustn't contract this virus, it will kill you. And so the immediate period of March 2020 was one of intense anxiety. In fact, I've never been in a room full of people who were more frightened than being on the immunology ward where I was being given my immune therapy, and just seeing the kind of realization spread from person to immunocompromised person in this room that for the indefinite future there was going to be this background existential threat that would hang over everything that went on. And we went into lockdown earlier than the official calls in the UK. It was the 6th of March 2020 that we decided we needed to go, and what was then called shielding. And it hasn't really changed since then. We are isolated from friends and family. We will let them come visit if they can isolate for 10 days before they come, but that's quite a big ask of friends who have other lives to lead. We will see people outside in the garden if they've done a lateral flow test. As long as they're not coming and sneezing and looking like they're dying and they're clear on the lateral flow test. Yes, okay, that's fine. But really, it's been quite a substantive narrowing of world purview. Before the pandemic, in a typical week, I could be anywhere around the globe. Whether that was Tokyo or Cambridge, Massachusetts, or even over in Geneva, where you are. But that dried up overnight, and who knows whether that will ever return at this current point. So I'm keen to stress that I'm in many ways quite privileged. I work for an employer who takes care of me. I feel as though I've been protected. But on the other hand, it is getting to a point now where this isolation and constant threat feels quite oppressive and is also an impediment just to the day-to-day vibrancy of life, really.
Of course, and hence the first 2 year. This it's you mentioned, and maybe let's expand on this just a bit as to why. Well, you mentioned why, of course, you're so vulnerable now, but you also mentioned in the piece that in 2023 you might have some good news, but that's not confirmed. Can you just talk about that first?
Sure. So my immune system is boosted 5 days a week by injections of a blood transfusion product called which has immunoglobulins in it. So basically, I get synthetic immunity from the donation process. It takes 1,000 donations to make a single batch of this blood product, and it's stored for 3 years. So essentially, before the pandemic, there are no antibodies among anybody to this new novel coronavirus. So the immunoglobulins give no protection. 3 years down the road, the donations have come from a period when the virus was running riot. So the hope is that 3 years after the start of the pandemic, my therapy will have um, protection built in. But the problem is that will only be against the first variant, not against the subsequent ones necessarily. And immune escape will mean that we're back to square one on that countdown from the 3 year phase. So again, I'm fortunate in many ways that I received this incredibly expensive treatment. On the other hand, it's not the silver bullet that one might hope for.
No, and I mean, I guess it's just worth pointing out that when we say good news, we're still talking about having to wait an entire year, which is not the easiest thing to do. So, as I mentioned, I recently got COVID. As far as I can tell, I got it on Friday 2 weeks ago because the government removed certain measures. So, as of April 1st, they removed all of them. Before that, you still had to wear your mask in like public transport and in hospitals, and you still had to self-isolate after actually getting COVID. That's what they removed on the 1st of April. But as of early February, I'm going to say, I actually forgot, they already removed masks indoors in like restaurants, cafes, cinemas, that sort of thing. And my best guess is that I got COVID at a cinema because I was the only one who was masked there, and I was hoping that the room was like big enough that I wouldn't get it. But there you go. And I couldn't think of any other place where I would have gotten it unless I got really unlucky at like the supermarket or something, where I would kind of stay 10 minutes and then leave, do my shopping quickly. And I self-isolated for a few days, and despite that, my wife got it, and so we've been on this prolonged quarantine for barely a bit more than the usual, I guess, about 2 weeks, a little over 2 weeks now. We're lucky also in the sense that, well, for one, we got 3 doses of the vaccine. Switzerland on that front has been fine, I would say. It's actually, there's a problem of vaccine hoarding from the global south, which a lot of people have been talking about, of course. So on that front, we're okay. And we're sort of hoping that because it wasn't that long after the third dose, which was on January this year that we had the third dose, that hopefully our immune system was high enough that we will avoid long-term effects, which was always my worry. Well, after the second dose, especially, that was my main worry. And I remember I had this chat. I think it was about a year ago. Time is very blurry at this point, but I think it was about a year ago. And I had this chat with a friend of mine who's in Berlin. And I told him that the reason why I'm worried about getting COVID isn't just literally getting COVID, but it's because of this seeming acceptance that we have been seeing in societies. And I used to be in the UK for 4 years. So I'm still following UK news a lot. So I was partly referring to that, and he's English as well. But in Switzerland, to be honest, it has not been that different on that front. There's never been really a lockdown, for example, in Switzerland. They've taken a different route, and that's why at one point they were actually the highest. They had the highest per capita infections or something like that. I believe it was end of 2020 or something along those lines. But the details I might be getting them wrong. But anyway, the reason I'm mentioning this story is because I was already paying attention. I'm autistic, and so I pay attention to, let's say, sensitive to ableism in general and to these kinds of problems, even though physically I don't have anything as far as I can tell. And I could already see the rhetoric or the discourse in a lot of, really everywhere, to be honest, that there was a difference between what counts as bad, what counts as this is a deadly disease, and usually it's the amount of people who actually die. And we seem to have accepted a certain number of people who can die on a weekly basis, and that doesn't count as too much anymore because of shifting baselines and other huge problems that I actually talk about on this podcast often. But of course, there's also the fact, and I have you mentioned some statistics. Actually, I'll just let you mention them, of like a majority were what the government would label as disabled, and of the deaths especially. That again, there was a separation between is it hurting or killing most of the population, or quote unquote only those who are disabled. And that, second half of the sentence, that's where a lot of dark connotations, I think, end up playing out. But yeah, I'll just be curious to your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the pandemic has been a story of massive inequality and differentiated outcomes between different groups.
Yeah.
If if the pandemic universally affected everybody in the same way, we wouldn't have a lot of the social discord that has come about. Um, I think, yeah, so to go back to those statistics, it turns out that in 2020 in the UK, 6 out of every 10 people who died from the virus would have classified themselves as disabled. And, on shifting baselines, we've still got two jumbo jets worth of deaths every week
Mm-hmm.
here from the virus. So can you imagine, a Lockerbie disaster twice every week and still having air travel?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think I probably can now, actually. But it seems like that should be an unimaginable shift in the public consciousness, but it turns out to be easier than we might think. I suppose also what you say about different types of outcome between different types of people is interesting and important here. So the fact that for some people it means near certain death, whereas for others it means symptoms they believe to be like a mild cold, really is a huge disparity. And governments have flocked to the lowest common denominator in terms of what they're willing to protect against. On the other hand, I'm not sure that's an entirely sensible way to behave towards a virus that we do not have long term data on, that we don't really fully understand, and that seems to have multi-systemic organ complications throughout. So there's this very quick rush to believe that, oh, COVID is mild in most cases. But as you say, this prevalence of long COVID shows that actually something is going on here that isn't normal. And we seem willing to gamble that everything will be okay, as opposed to playing it safe and saying, perhaps we don't wish to engender the possibility of long-term disability in a whole cohort of school-age children who have not yet been given vaccinations in the UK. So I'm really interested in the way that inequality, risk, baseline perception are all playing out within a political economy that, as you say, then seems rife with this discourse of almost soft eugenics, ableism, in quite a problematic and troubling way.
That's exactly it. Because again, I don't know if I will develop long COVID. I hope I won't. Obviously, I'm trying not to freak out about it because I spent, well, me and my wife, we spent 2+ years being pretty strict on um, basically not getting it at all costs, essentially. And the just the very idea that it took me one outing. I'm like just as some context, my PhD is on cinema, and I'm a cinephile, and I spent 2+ years before that not going to any cinema. So as soon as I found an opportunity, I took it, and I thought the risks were quote unquote reasonable, because I would be wearing my mask and there was some distancing in just de facto because the place was big enough. But who knows? I mean, maybe it wasn't even there. Obviously, I have no. I was still going to the supermarket because, well, I have to. So maybe it was there. I really can't tell for sure. But by the time I got it, which again is about 2 weeks ago now, just over 2 weeks ago, by my best estimate, about 3 weeks to or 4 weeks, I want to say, of time had already passed where people were getting used to no longer wearing a mask, indoors, I mean, specifically. So the cafe, the library, that sort of thing, those are the two places I would mostly go to, well, to work mostly, or to read a book or what have you, when the weather is bad and I can't sit outside. It felt overnight. It was a decision that they kind of did make pretty quickly, and within a couple of days, the initial wave of restrictions, I should say, were lifted. And then, despite the fact that they had a spike in cases, after that, they decided to, well, essentially double down in many ways. And what's extraordinary to me is that I've been following some of the local media. It's really been, you know, Geneva finds its smile again, and, that sort of thing, which I've seen media the world over repeat the same kind of discourse. Um, and I do admit that I was, and still am, I'm trying to not freak out, like physically freak out, because that doesn't help, but I've been very worried for the past couple of months now. And not just because of the policies themselves, but I'm seeing how policies are already affecting attitudes in people that I knew, like, friends or relatives or whatnot who live either here or not even in Switzerland. Just the again, because, now there is almost a social pressure to act as if there isn't a pandemic anymore. And it's difficult to fight it, other than trying to be extra careful, me and my wife. But if everyone around you is doing something and everyone around you is sort of still going to cafes, or they want to go out, or they want you at some point, I don't know how long we will last, essentially. I mean, I'm saying this, I think we will still be very strict, but I'm saying that the social pressures are not, they're in sharp contrast to almost exactly 2 years ago now, when we would go out to our balconies at 8 p.m. and applaud, medical workers and what have you. Now, just 2 years later, even though we still have this deadly virus, it's the exact opposite. Um, so yeah, I don't know. I don't even have a question on this, to be honest. It's just something that I'm definitely still trying to cope with, to be honest.
Well, I saw on, I'm not going to name and shame the Twitter account, but it was an academic on Twitter the other week actually had quite a long rant about a society-wide hypochondria, as they termed it, and how people's health anxiety is now ruining contemporary society since the virus because they couldn't go out and do exactly what they wanted. And it just, I don't know, it filled me with a kind of despair on the first front because their reality is not the same as my reality.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still under very strict warning from immunology that I'm in deep trouble if I get this virus, and it would be much better not to contract it. But also, the way that this discourse seems to me to shift quite rapidly from um, a libertarian politics of freedom to do what you want
Mm-hmm.
into a kind of hate speech almost against those who want to keep or need to keep safe. And somehow these two things very easily slide between each other in a way that is alarming politically, I think. Um, I also am interested in the way that the discourses of mental health have played out around
Mm,
this and are actually weaponized in quite a nasty way. So, I'm going to try and be sensitive talking around this because mental health is a difficult thing to speak
of
about.
course.
But um, the the discourse against lockdowns from again that libertarian sector has, I think, cynically manipulated the discourse of mental health here, and it appropriates it in a way that says lockdowns are bad for society because people's isolation obviously is a problem and so forth. And I'm not denying that that is the case in some ways, but at the same time, that same set thinks that it's acceptable that a portion of the population, which is not a small portion who remain vulnerable, are perfectly able to stay isolated indefinitely and should live their lives in complete and utter segregation from the rest of the world because that allows everybody else to get on with it. Um, I don't know whether you're a Star Trek fan, but I've
Very
often
much so.
thought about I've often thought about the Vulcan proverb, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few,
Mm,
and thought it's actually quite a problematic
yeah.
philosophy in lots of ways. Yes, it seems noble when first you come to it, but our laws, societies, civilizations are meant also to protect vulnerable minorities from natural and social ravages that might otherwise uh,
Hmm.
cause them serious damage. And it seems to me that principle has been radically abandoned in the latest phase of the pandemic.
Yeah, I actually have a concrete example just to because you mentioned how there is the assumption that those who quote unquote will have to basically stay in lockdown, that they can just manage, they can just find what have you. Like as it happens, this week I was supposed to go to Zurich to do a class, and at first I thought it would be in hybrid mode. So I thought, well, I would have at least the option. That was before I got COVID. I thought I would have the option to stay at home in case something happened, but as it turned out, there isn't. There wasn't a hybrid mode. It's just a bunch of lectures. So I figured maybe the professor would be willing to just open Zoom account or what have you, and I would listen in that way. But they just said no, and so I had to just earlier today I had to cancel attendance to that class. Um, and what's kind of wild about this is that the professor himself got COVID last week. So like his recovery period is actually shorter than mine. Mine is actually a bit longer. And what kind of scares me about this is that I would have been, if I had gone, I would have been in a room with other students. Legally, I even if I did have COVID, I could have chosen to not even wear a mask. All of those other students can contract COVID, and whatever short-term or long-term health impacts they would have, I would have to live with that in my mind, like just on my it's a stain on my conscience. And obviously, I did not want that, and so I canceled my attendance, and now I need to figure out how to take that extra credit now. Which I will find a way. It's fine. I mean, it's not fine, but it's manageable in my case. If I was immunocompromised, the options right now would literally be either you risk it all for one credit, or you or you don't do it, or you don't do the class, and you have to figure it out. Um, there isn't. I Part of it is a very. I don't know if it's a generalization, but I've been here for 2 years, and I'm trying to be kind of an observer as well of the political culture that's around me. There does seem to be a every person to his own or her own kind of situation in Switzerland. As I said, there's never really been a collective lockdown. Not vaccine testing wasn't even available before like a year into the pandemic, because of the insurance system and a bunch of other complicated stuff that's too boring to mention here. At some point, it was just, yeah, it's if you get it, then you get it, figure it out, and good luck to you. There wasn't a, there was, I don't know how to describe it. It is, I don't think calling it soft eugenics or what have you is an exaggeration on this. I really don't think it is, especially in a country like this one. Now it's, by any objective measure, it's worse. Epidemiologists were quoted in all sorts of media here over the past couple of months before they removed the first sets of measures, and then after even now, basically past few days, saying like this is not a good idea. This is not a good idea. It should be a much slower process. Some of them would say, others would say there should at least, at the very least, still be the mask mandates because we know obviously that COVID is airborne. You know, all of those things, and it's just been ignored. And what's baffling to me is that I'm seeing the media follow suit. One of the websites I kind of follow a lot is Swiss Info, and they're pretty good overall on most things as far as I can tell. But they decided, I think, about a month. No, they decided when the first measures were removed to no longer update daily, as they have been doing for 2 years now.
Yeah.
As if this now means that, well, you know, a major publication is no longer updating daily. I think the messages that that sends is pretty, you know, pretty straightforward. Um, and as I mentioned before, my wife and I are pretty lucky in the sense that we both work remotely. Um, when I moved to Switzerland, I had already done 2 years, so I'm of the PhD, so I'm in the writing phase, and so I didn't actually need to be physically present anywhere. I can just go to the library from time to time, and it's been working well as a PhD works. You know, with all the caveats of that comes with. And in her case, she also works from home and that sort of thing. So we're okay on that. But it is weird that we are now living at the moments where we have to count on being lucky with our work environment uh, to avoid getting a deadly virus, or in our case, a potentially deadly virus, especially, or if not deadly. I mean, deadly isn't the only criteria. Obviously, you know, um, lifetime worth of health impacts could still follow. Obviously.
I think also, I mean, you're obviously a very good person who has that conscience about not infecting other people. But the problem is that doesn't seem to be the case society wide, and the effects of COVID are negative externalities. So the public good, the good for you of going to the lecture would obviously be that you would get your education, you'd do your credit, and you can displace the negative aspects onto somebody else in the
Mm-hmm.
room without there being any additional, apart from the mental conscience thing, any impact on you directly. And so again, this seems to me that this is an environment where lawmaking and politics should have a role. For instance, we don't let people just pollute the environment around us so that they can make their own profit.
Mm-hmm.
So why do we think a virus is a different thing there? And I wonder if there's something to do with the apparent naturalness of the virus and this nature culture distinction that problematically says that we can't be held responsible for passing on viruses because they just happen and you're just going to have to learn to live with it
Mm-hmm.
or
Mm-hmm.
something like that. But that seems to be at work. I also it's interesting you talk about mask mandates. I've been really surprised by how apparently offensive it is to have to wear a mask. For me, that doesn't really seem actually the end of the world if it's an act of politeness. For instance, I went to Japan a few years ago to give a talk, and it was just common practice that actually it's rude to blow your nose in public
Mm-hmm.
because you could give someone else an infection. People wear masks to protect themselves and others, and it's regularly accepted. So I mean, how much of an overgrown child do you have to be to really think that the end of the world is being asked to wear a mask in public to protect other people? Um, and curiously, those are often the quarters from which the discourses of snowflake are being meted out, whereas they can't even take. Can you wear a mask, please, to protect other people?
Oh, for sure. And I mean, Japan is a good example because I know at least from the case of Taiwan, of both Taiwan and South Korea, that, well, Taiwan, I'm gonna speak to Taiwan specifically just because I studied it a bit more, where they were pretty good and are still relatively good at dealing with this, partly because there was already a pre-existing culture of just wearing your mask when you feel you can pass something on to your neighbor. Um, I was sort of hoping, and maybe I'm gonna maintain that hope just because, but I was sort of hoping that as we get used to wearing a mask 2 years into this, that maybe even post COVID, we would start wearing masks when, we have a cold or what have you, rather than just assume that we can just pass it on to someone else. Um, Even though for the most part colds aren't deadly or what have you, at least where we live, but again, just as a matter of politeness, it's not fun to have one. Um, but given that that's not what we're seeing, and the trend is definitely not towards that, I'm sort of, yeah, I find myself just trying to calm myself down and not think of the worst case scenarios and hope that maybe we outrun or we outlive this thing, even though all of the data isn't, you know, supporting that conclusion. But it's like I'm taking my precautions and I'm being as responsible as I can, like physically, I mean. And otherwise, I don't know what else to do, essentially. And the reason why I say this isn't, I don't want to sound like fatalistic or anything like that. It's more that I rely a lot on circles of friends and like just people around me in general, either who live nearby or who don't. Most don't actually, and certain like a shared attitude that we have towards things in general, climate change, social equalities, what have you. And we don't have to agree on everything, but basically, like let us agree on some of the basics. On COVID, the basics was we have to just stay vigilant, be careful. We don't have to freak out, as in, we can still see each other from time to time as long as we take precautions, etc., etc. Um, but we still need to take those precautions, and that has been withering away. I would say in the past few months, definitely, and it went from not that long ago, like up to we got married in October 2021, so 6 months ago or so. And back then it was still everyone was very careful. We encouraged everyone to do tests and that sort of thing. And then Christmas happens, and then just like that, suddenly there isn't that worry anymore. And what wor maybe I'm repeating myself a bit, but what kind of worries me most, as far as personally, is that if I do get long COVID or some associated symptoms, I mean, something related to long COVID, or if it affects my body in a different way that we don't understand yet, um, this will I will be a person with some kind of illness in a society or in a political culture that has already shown that it would be willing to kill me off, essentially. And for me, it is probably it's an autistic thing. I don't know. It is very easy for me to just picture these scenarios and not see them as fictional impossibilities that we can just think, mentally postpone or what have you. It's just these are the facts and that's it. It's like A leads to B and it's not complicated, essentially. I don't have these, at least not to the same extent as far as I can understand, that these filters, cultural filters, if you want, of, well, everything that we're already talking about. And so it's difficult because at some point I'm not the only person, but among the few people in what feels like basically a smaller, ever shrinking number of people that sound alarmist. Like sound like you're the person, ringing the end is nigh, convert or what have you. Essentially, when I'm just reading the latest scientific papers and concluding based on that. And I have a background in my undergrad, I should say it's in environmental health, so I can at least read those papers and the conclusions are pretty straightforward. But yeah, here we are.
I mean, one of the things that strike me, just to go back to the cultural differences in terms of mask wearing, is that um, the early phase of the virus was dominated by a kind of xenophobia,
Mm-hmm.
in which China was blamed, particularly in US
Yeah.
politics, for the spreading the virus, and a Japanophobia probably also creeps into this. And my suspicion is that a solution to stopping the spread of the virus, like masking, that came from an Asian cultural community would not find political home in the West because there is this ingrained prejudice against those types of cultures. So I wonder whether the very fact that Japan and China have masking cultures has actually, in a sense, amid that those phobias backfired against our own ability to control it. So a bit of a hypothesis there, but an interesting one.
Well, I do think that one thing that was very obvious, um, to me at least, in the early days, first few months, I mean, honestly, first year, or I don't know when I stopped really, but I was checking on a daily basis. I was checking The Guardian, I was checking New York Times, I was reading some of the scientific papers directly, and those various websites that gather data, um, as well as some of the different governments, especially the Swiss one, because we live here. And I did find that even then, I remember like a little less than 2 years ago, I did find it striking that despite the fact that a country like Taiwan, and there's a good episode, I'm spacing out on the name, but they were talking about how Taiwan managed to control it at the time, and it wasn't that complicated. Mass testing, free mass testing, everyone with a mask, social distancing, the whole "we are all in this together"ness of things, and I just don't remember that method. Not just Taiwan, the various countries that I'm now spacing out on the specifics. I think South Korea was a relatively success case at some point. I don't remember, but different countries were doing it better essentially, and we were not learning from it. Like there was no. Again, I try and closely like to pay attention closely. There was like the odd op-ed and one investigation here and there, but it wasn't a dominant part of the cultural discourse to sort of say, well, let's adopt the Taiwan model and we'll be better off. It was, no, we're Swiss, we're Brits, we're French, we're Germans, we're what have you. We obviously know better, and we'll just figure out a way, regardless of what's happening over there, and we don't have to think about it. And I do think, you know, I don't think you're far off with that. Essentially, I do think there's something to it that there is almost a we have to be humble in many ways, and we don't want to be, to accept that, well, our method in dealing with this virus was objectively much worse than what Taiwan did. Not obviously because Taiwan dealt with a pandemic not that long ago, a decade ago or so. In a better or smarter world, we would have just adopted the best practices and gone with that, but we just didn't. And so I don't think you're wrong on that. At least I think that there's something to it for sure.
I think, yeah, the basic cultural implication is a question of from where we're willing to learn. And I think in the global north, to use a term that is contentious but
Mm-hmm.
nonetheless useful, we like to think of ourselves as knowledge exporters. We publish stuff in high priority journals, and the rest of the world learns from it. We're not very good at working the other way around in a system of global exchange. It's perhaps less true of Japan than it used to be,
Yeah.
given the rapid industrialization since the mid 20th century. But on the other hand, it does provoke these questions.
And then,
I also
mm,
I was just going to go back to your point about life, and whether your life is worth much.
mm,
Really, I think in the UK context in particular, this discourse has been there for quite a long time. As you are probably aware,
mm-hmm.
the UN Disability Rights Commission has found the UK government's policy to be discriminatory and very disgusting in lots of ways. But the pandemic has made it really explicit. It just we dropped all pretense at a nice front that we're going to protect people in these categories and that they're worth something. It's refreshing in some ways, but it's also distressing and extremely worrying to see such open displays of disability hate, really. And as you said, soft eugenics is an apt term.
Oh, and obviously ageism in the early days, especially. I remember a lot of. There's a horrible term that I remember, which is the boomer remover. I remember that one. and there was a number of yeah, I mean similar terms, or at the very least, it stands that well we have to protect our elderly, but there was always this but. There's the sense of well, to some extent it's natural. There's this. I'm hoping that we can get to a point where we're able to ask ourselves very critical questions on what is it in our political culture, and I insist on saying political culture specifically, because culture is such a broad and vague term at times. Um, but in the sense of what we consider worth it. I mean, you say yourself, and obviously, if the virus was affecting everyone in the same way, probably we would have figured out a way to stop it a long time ago. Have a global zero COVID policy at this point. But I also have this theory that if the virus was visible, like you could literally see blue dots coming out of people's mouths or whatever, droplets, we would be more freaked out about it. We would literally be avoiding it, like on the streets or in a cafe, or we would be seeing it, and yet there is a I don't know how to, like, I don't want to maybe get too philosophical about it or what have you, but there is a disconnect between us and our bodies, if that makes sense. As if like we're not our bodies, as if our bodies just is can handle something differently than what our mental state can. And and I'm not saying this like as someone who doesn't do that. I actually think I do this to some extent. I don't think I'm completely divorced from this attitude either. But I'm saying that at the very least, it should be part of the critical rethinking of why we have been, especially in the past few months, so reckless with something that we know based on the data and the studies that have already happened so far, that it can still affect, even if you do have, even if you're not immunocompromised, and even if you are vaccinated and you got it, which is my case now. Like, as far as I can understand, my immunity is as high as it can get at this point, basically, because I got 3 doses and then I got it. That does not mean that in 5 years I won't have some kind of side effect, or I don't know. At this point I just basically have to hope for it, and obviously try and take care of my health as much as I can. But it's just one of those things. It causes, what was the term, multi-system failure or something like that, or it affects things on a multi-system level. I forgot what the term was. But yeah. Sorry, again, no questions on that. I'm just.
I mean, it's interesting also that you talked about the kind of sensory visibility of COVID,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm struck. I think you're absolutely right. If we could see COVID, that would be different. But one of the things we can actually do is smell particulate gases from quite a way away. If somebody's been smoking and they walk past you, you can actually get a sense of, oh my word, that person is 6 meters away, but I can smell
Mm-hmm.
their smoke.
Mm-hmm.
And if that was actually the principle on which we worked, that would be a really good measure of how you're going to get COVID. If you can smell someone's cigarette from the distance you're at, you could potentially contract an aerosol-borne pathogen. So there's also an interesting hierarchy here of how we value different senses and
Mm-hmm.
different abilities. Sight is obviously given the greatest societal prevalence,
Yeah.
but there was never this focus on smell and breathing that really, surely you'd think would be absolutely key to managing a pathogen like this.
Mm-hmm.
I guess in your individual case, I wish you completely the best, and I hope that it just pans out to be a good long term. You're absolutely fine, and
Hopefully,
it
yeah.
was just a blip. But it's not unreasonable to be anxious about the long term consequences of a virus that is completely novel and about which we don't know much at the moment. And most people seem very happy to gamble with that, whereas I feel in my life, I've had a lot of health setbacks. I've had a stroke as well as a result of my arthritis, which surprises people. But rheumatoid arthritis attacks the blood vessels, and that caused me to have a stroke.
Mm.
And those moments where my whole life changed afterwards as a result of illness really are, for me, key milestones in my life, not positive ones. So I feel that healthy people who are willing to take a risk with their health often don't know what they might lose if they're not careful, and it makes me feel a bit queasy seeing people just happy to say I'm going to give it a chance, because you don't get a second second chance with your health.
And again, I really think people who say that um, assume that when I don't know, there is just this sense that I get that they assume that it just won't be them. Um, like they cannot become disabled or they cannot become immunocompromised, as if you're either born with it and that's the only scenario that exists. And obviously, for many people, they are born with it or what have you, but it can also develop in childhood and adulthood and what have you. And it probably has to go back to, again, a political culture that does not want to deal with these things. And from government to media to, I don't know, education system, maybe I can probably blame everything at this point, but um, it is concerning. And so for me personally, I'm trying to, part of this episode's purpose actually is that now I can send people an episode and tell them, hey, can you just listen to this one, listen to this episode, and let's have a conversation about it later, because otherwise I'm every single time in like every on a daily basis, maybe in so many different interactions, I'm gonna feel like a madman. I'm gonna feel like I'm losing my mind. Like I'm just repeating this very obvious thing, as if we have not spent 2 years, we as in people, have not spent the past 2 years agreeing on this thing and saying that this thing is obviously not good and we need to avoid it, and that's it. And we go from this to relatives of mine, again 6 months ago, being utterly paranoid of getting it, to now comparing it to the flu, and which I think they mean a cold when they say the flu, they don't mean the flu. And that, will pass, and that's it. It will pass, and everything will be fine. And it's almost like a mantra. We're supposed to repeat it enough time, and if we do it enough time, it will become true or something. And
So
I obviously don't want that.
what I think is interesting as well is this the idea, thinking within disability context, of the idea that anybody can become disabled and it could be you that ends up in that position. It's at once a very powerful driver of empathy and understanding, and at the same time quite a problematic concept.
Mhm.
And on the one hand, yes, all right, okay, if it encourages people to think better about others and to help them because they can see themselves in that other person, then that's great. But on the other hand, it's a model in which disability, illness, and so on are a threat, and the disabled person
Mhm.
is a reminder of that potential threat
Mhm.
to the
Mhm.
self.
Mhm.
So the fact that disability can happen to anyone doesn't necessarily translate into empathy. It can translate into a fear and withdrawal. So that's the kind of interesting parallel I've found in the COVID era. Is yes, you might be the person who does get long COVID, and you end up in trouble, but that doesn't mean that you empathise with people who are at higher risk necessarily. And it's highlighted that in quite a problematic way.
That's a good point. Thank you for pointing that out. I guess for me, I actually didn't think about this because I'm autistic, and there's already quite a lot of people who think that this is just a contagious thing, and they can either get it from a vaccine or whatever. And so I think I just took it for granted that many people think that way. But yeah, before we get into the book section, which is how we finish all episodes on this podcast, um, I know that you also have been correct me if I'm wrong, but like working on like open access and that sort of thing. And we do have this in common as well. I've been doing this PhD for, well, 4.5 years now, although it feels like 50 years, and hopefully done in a few months. And my topic is relatively obscure. It's like Lebanese cinema, and I had to. So much of my work was just actually finding them, or at least getting them, getting some copy. It was all about just getting the source essentially, and I relied a lot on open access information. Um, I can legit say that without websites that have papers that would otherwise not be available, I would not have been able to do this PhD. It's really that straightforward. I would have actually quit. It was just not, with COVID especially. I would not be it would just not be physically possible. So yeah, I was just curious to answer your thoughts on this, and then we can jump into the book section.
Yeah, I mean, since I did my PhD a decade or so ago, decade and a half ago, I have been working extensively on open access to research work in the humanities disciplines in particular. For me, the academic publishing system with paywalls is just not fulfilling the potential of what we could do with knowledge in society. And although perhaps my faith in the ability of science and rationality and the humanities to change public perceptions has been dented by COVID, on the other hand, I don't see how we can expect to have an educated population who engage critically in democratic functions if they can't get access to the fruits of knowledge. So I founded a platform called the Open Library of Humanities that publishes 32 open access journals and is funded by 320 or so academic libraries worldwide. All of my 9 books are openly accessible and can be downloaded and read for free. All of my journal articles, likewise, are open access, and I think it's a really important part of what I do. I mean, I'm only going to live a certain number of years on this earth. What I really don't want is that everything I've written is going to remain behind a paywall for up to 70 years after I die as well. So, I feel as though by pursuing open access for my own writings, I am able to do much more good in the world and feel that there is a vocational aspect to working and teaching in higher education.
Absolutely. And I mean, in the spirit of that, what are 3 books that you would recommend to our listeners?
Okay, so I realized that even though I'm a professor of English, I haven't really actually read a novel since Christmas. But I've gone and recommended 3 novels, in fact. So rather than non-fiction, here are 3 novels that I really enjoyed, and I'll just briefly say why. So The Overstory by Richard Powers, absolutely remarkable book, sort of contemporary ecological parable that I couldn't put it down. It's not didactic. It's a little bit tricky to get started with, but hugely enjoyable. Thoroughly recommended from just a couple of years ago. Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow remains my favourite book of all time. I ended up doing an undergraduate dissertation, a master's dissertation, a PhD, and a book on it. It was a lifetime of obsession almost. An off-the-wall historical novel that just rewards close rereading as many times as you go back. So not exactly easy again, but incredible. And lastly, David Grossman's book Sea Under Love, which is Sea Under, as in an encyclopedia entry might say Sea Under X : Love, is the most astonishing novel about the Holocaust I've ever read. There are lots of books about the Holocaust. It's a staple generic trope in many ways now, but this one's like no other. Final chapter is an encyclopedia in which the narrative unfolds via that alphabetical structure rather than over the conventional fictional model. Thoroughly recommended.
Amazing. Well, I've heard of the first 2. I haven't heard of. I think I've heard of the third author. Remind me his name. Sorry.
David Grossman.
Yeah, he's well known, right? He's written other.
Yeah, he's a well-known Israeli author.
Right.
With leftist political sympathies and a very interesting experimental writing career.
Amazing. Okay, well, thanks for that. I definitely need to check out all 3 books, and I say this after every episode, but in this case, I do actually want to read those 3 books. Well, Martin, thank you a lot for your time. This was really informative, and hopefully people listening will find it so as well, which I'm sure they would. And yeah, thanks for everything.
Thank you so much, Joey. Really appreciate your time today.
Pleasure. The Fire These Times is hosted by myself, Joey Ayoub. I am also its producer, researcher, writer, and sound editor. If you want to help turn this project into a full-time job, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes to support it. These episodes are part of a bigger project which includes resources, a newsletter, and eventually YouTube video essays as well. As always, thank you for listening and take care.